December, height of Cold War tension. In the concrete bunker of a Soviet listening post near the Arctic Circle, operators huddle around glowing radar screens, their eyes fixed on the blips of incoming aircraft. Above them, in a war room lined with maps and communication equipment, senior officers in pressed uniforms pace back and forth, their confidence unshaken. This is supposed to be an impenetrable wall, a sophisticated early warning network that can detect any American incursion within seconds. For 30 years, Soviet radar has never failed to catch intruders. Until tonight. The first sign is not what appears on the screens, it's what doesn't appear. A lieutenant's hand trembles as he reaches for the phone to alert Colonel Petrov. The words stick in his throat. How do you tell your commanding officer that something impossible is happening? That somewhere in the darkness above them, American helicopters are landing, and the radar has seen absolutely nothing. Colonel Nikolai Petrov had built his entire career on one ironclad principle. Nothing moves through Soviet airspace undetected. Not anymore. Not on his watch. He was 53 years old, with the bearing of a man who had served through the height of Soviet military power. His uniform was immaculate, pressed so sharply you could draw blood on the creases. His hair, still dark despite the years, was cut with military precision. But it was his eyes that told the real story. They were the eyes of someone who had never made a mistake and intended to keep it that way. The Arctic listening post he commanded was one of the most sophisticated installations in the entire Soviet Union. Built deep into the permafrost, reinforced with meters of concrete and steel, it represented 3 decades of incremental technological advancement. Every system was state-of-the-art. Every operator was hand-selected from the finest military academies. The radar array alone had cost more than a small city. It was supposed to be untouchable, impenetrable, Soviet. For 30 years, it had been exactly that. Then, in the autumn of 1986, the reports started coming in. At first they were dismissed as equipment malfunctions, a blip that vanished too quickly, a signal that seemed to appear from nowhere and then simply ceased to exist. Colonel Petrov ordered diagnostics. The technicians ran their tests. Everything checked out perfectly. The equipment was functioning flawlessly. The problem, if there was a problem, wasn't with Soviet radar. It had to be something else. The intelligence briefings from Moscow were vague, almost evasive. There were rumors of American stealth technology, aircraft designed to evade radar detection. Petrov had read the reports with something approaching contempt. Physics doesn't bend to propaganda. Radio waves follow predictable laws. You cannot simply will an aircraft invisible. The Americans, for all their capitalist abundance, were not magicians. They were engineers. And engineers worked within the constraints of reality. Yet the reports kept coming. More sightings, more anomalies, more inexplicable gaps in the radar coverage that shouldn't have existed. By October, something had changed. The incidents were no longer scattered anomalies. They were forming a pattern, a terrible, undeniable pattern. On October 14th, a flight of 4 helicopters appeared on the periphery of the listening post's coverage area. The operators tracked them for approximately 45 seconds. Then the blips simply vanished, not gradually fading as an aircraft would when flying away. They didn't climb out of range or descend below the radar horizon. The helicopters didn't jam the signal. There was no electromagnetic interference, no distortion, nothing. They were simply there, and then they weren't, as if someone had reached into the radar screen and erased them. Petrov stood in the war room when the report came in. He remembered the exact moment, remembered the way the lieutenant's voice wavered over the secure line. Remembered the cold feeling that settled in his chest, the one he hadn't felt since his early days as a junior officer, when the world still held surprises. "Run the diagnostics again," he had ordered, his voice giving nothing away. They did. Everything was perfect. "Check the maintenance logs. Any recent repairs? Any work on the antenna array?" Nothing. No recent work. No recent repairs. Everything was exactly as it should be. Petrov had stood very still for a long moment. He could feel the weight of command settling on his shoulders like a physical thing. Somewhere above the frozen landscape, somewhere in the darkness and the cold, American helicopters had just landed near a Soviet military installation. and his radar hadn't even known they were coming. More than that, his radar still didn't know they had been there at all. By late October, there were 6 confirmed incidents. By mid-November, the number had climbed to 14. Each one followed the same pattern. The helicopters would appear on the radar screen for a brief moment, sometimes 30 seconds, sometimes just a handful of seconds, and then vanish completely. Intelligence confirmed that they weren't leaving the area. They were landing. They were conducting operations on Soviet territory. And then, just as mysteriously, they would lift off and disappear again. Petrov had made the decision that haunted him still. He had reported the incidents to Moscow, not minimized them, not downplayed them or tried to cover them up. He had given the full truth, unvarnished and complete. An entire flight of American helicopters was conducting sustained operations within his operational area. His radar couldn't track them. His defenses couldn't intercept them. The Iron Curtain, the technological barrier that was supposed to keep the Soviet Union safe, had a hole in it the size of an entire squadron. The response from Moscow was swift and merciless. Questions, accusations, demands for explanations. How had this happened? Who was responsible? Was there sabotage? Were there traitors in the ranks? Petrov had sat through video conference calls with generals who looked like they wanted to reach through the screen and strangle him with their bare hands. The pressure was suffocating. The shame was worse. Everything he had believed about Soviet technological superiority, everything he had built his career on, suddenly seemed fragile, temporary, built on sand instead of stone. And then, in early December, came the breakthrough that would change everything. The analysis room was a smaller space than the main radar center, tucked away in a corner of the bunker where the walls were even thicker and the security even tighter. Petrov rarely came here. This was where the theorists worked, the physicists and mathematicians who tried to understand not just what the radar showed, but why it showed what it showed. Captain Viktor Sokolov was one of these theorists. A thin man in his late 30s with wire-rimmed glasses and the perpetually distracted air of someone whose mind was usually somewhere else entirely, Sokolov had studied at Moscow State University and published papers on electromagnetic propagation that were considered groundbreaking in Soviet military circles. He was, by any reasonable measure, a genius, and he had been quietly, systematically recording every radar anomaly for the past 2 months. "Colonel," Sokolov said, looking up from a desk covered in printouts and sketches, "I think I understand what we're looking at." Petrov felt something shift in his chest. "Explain." Sokolov stood and began pulling down charts, technical diagrams showing radar cross-sections, wave propagation patterns, signal reflection coefficients. He arranged them on the wall with the methodical precision of an artist constructing a masterpiece. Then he turned back to Petrov. "The helicopters are not invisible," Sokolov began. "I know how that sounds. I know what our instruments tell us. But I think that's precisely the point. They're not invisible in the sense that they don't exist. They're invisible in the sense that they're designed, specifically, mathematically, intentionally designed to be invisible to our radar." He pointed to one of the diagrams. "Our radar works by sending out electromagnetic waves. Those waves travel through the air, they strike an object, and they bounce back. The strength of the return signal, the pattern of that return, tells us what the object is and where it is. It's elegant. It's simple. It's predictable." Sokolov pulled up another diagram. This one showed angles. Sharp, severe angles. Nothing rounded or smooth. "But what if," Sokolov continued, "an object was designed with a specific geometry in mind? What if, instead of reflecting radio waves back to their source, it was shaped in such a way that it scattered them, reflected them away from the receiver, sent them off in random directions instead of back toward the antenna?" Petrov was quiet for a moment. He could feel the edges of understanding forming, like shapes emerging from fog. "You're saying the Americans have built helicopters with deliberately angular surfaces?" "Not just angular," Sokolov said. His eyes were bright now, animated with the intensity of a man who had just glimpsed a fundamental truth. "Specifically angled, each surface positioned to deflect incoming radar waves at precise angles. The fuselage, the rotor mast, the landing struts. Everything is calculated. Everything serves one purpose: to reduce the radar cross-section to the absolute minimum. He pointed to the recordings of the vanishing blips. This is what we see when they're transmitting back an echo that's so weak, so scattered, that it essentially disappears into the background noise. It's not magic, Colonel. It's physics. Very elegant. Very sophisticated physics, but physics nonetheless. Petrov felt something cold crystallize inside him. Not fear, exactly. Something harder than fear. If this is possible, he said slowly, then everything we've built, every radar array, every detection system, is obsolete, Sokolov finished. Or at least, it's obsolete against this specific threat. Yes. The words hung in the air between them like a physical thing. What followed was 3 weeks of intense analysis. Sokolov and a team of specialists worked around the clock, cross-referencing the radar recordings with theoretical models, conducting experiments with scaled models in electromagnetic chambers, running calculations on computers that filled entire rooms. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to reverse engineer the design principles. The Americans had taken principles that Soviet physicists had theorized about: radar cross-section reduction, wave scattering, geometric optimization, and they had actually built them. They had created a helicopter that could slip through Soviet radar defenses like a ghost walking through walls. Other officers struggled to accept it. General Volkov, head of the Arctic Theater's air defense, sat in one of these analysis sessions and said flatly, "Americans cannot defy physics." His voice carried the absolute certainty of a man who had built his entire career on the belief that Soviet physics was superior, and therefore Soviet technology was superior, and therefore Soviet military power was superior. "They're not defying physics," Sokolov replied carefully. "They're exploiting it." "There's a difference." "Then we exploit it better," Volkov snapped. "We design our own stealth helicopters. We make them invisible. We use this technology against the Americans." But even as he said it, everyone in the room knew the truth. It wasn't about designing better stealth. It was about the fact that the Americans had gotten here first. The Americans, with their capitalist abundance and their technological freedom, had achieved something that the Soviet Union, with all its military might and all its resources, had not achieved. They had done the impossible, and they had done it while standing on Soviet soil. The revelation spread through Soviet military circles like a virus. By early 1987, every air defense commander from the Baltic to the Pacific knew that American helicopters had penetrated Soviet airspace, and Soviet radar couldn't stop them. The implications were staggering. If stealth helicopters could evade detection, then what else could? Were there stealth fighters, stealth bombers? Had the Americans developed an entire fleet of invisible aircraft? The uncertainty was perhaps worse than the confirmed threat. At least you could plan for a known enemy. But an enemy that could appear without warning, that could conduct operations anywhere in Soviet territory without detection, that represented something fundamentally different. Intelligence reports suggested that the Americans weren't stopping with helicopters. There were rumors of a stealth bomber program, codenamed Have Blue. Reports of experimental aircraft with triangular shapes and radar cross-sections measured in square centimeters instead of square meters. The strategic balance, it seemed, had shifted overnight. The Soviet response was predictable. Accelerated development of new detection methods. Phased array radars with more advanced signal processing. Infrared detection systems. Acoustic sensors. The military threw resources at the problem like a man throwing sand at a rising tide, hoping something would stick. Some of it did. Not enough. Never enough. By 1988, the first confirmed sightings of stealth fighters operating over Soviet territory began. By 1989, NATO was conducting sustained air operations with impunity, aircraft that Soviet radar couldn't reliably track. The statistics told a story that Soviet military planners tried hard not to read. NATO fighter pilot casualties dropped dramatically. Bomber interception rates fell. The technological advantage that the Soviet Union had built over decades was evaporating. Colonel Petrov watched it happen from his bunker in the Arctic. He watched the doctrine adjustments come down from Moscow. He watched his radar operators, men and women he had trained, men and women who had trusted in Soviet technology, struggled to find targets that shouldn't exist, but did. In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the shock was political and economic. But for men like Petrov, the real shock had come years earlier. It had come in October 1986, when helicopters invisible to radar had landed near his listening post and vanished before his instruments could even register them as a threat. That was when he truly understood that an era had ended, that the world had changed in ways that couldn't be reversed. The technology that stealth represented, the mathematics of radar cross-section reduction, the discipline of designing complex machines to be invisible to radio waves. It was here now. It was real. It was deployed. And there was no going back. What the Soviet Union discovered in the frozen Arctic, sitting in concrete bunkers and staring at radar screens that suddenly couldn't see, was that technology doesn't progress in a linear fashion. It progresses through leaps and discontinuities. For 3 decades, everyone understood the rules of air warfare. You either had altitude, or you had speed, or you had maneuverability. If you had all 3, you were dominant. The Soviets had built their entire doctrine on this understanding. Then the Americans changed the rules entirely. They didn't build a faster aircraft. They didn't build a higher-flying aircraft. They built an invisible one. And in doing so, they demonstrated something fundamental. The future doesn't belong to those who optimize the old paradigm. It belongs to those who create a new one. Captain Sokolov, the physicist who first understood what he was looking at, would spend the rest of his career studying stealth technology. He became one of the world's leading experts on radar cross-section reduction, not because the Soviet Union valued his expertise, but because Russia couldn't afford not to. Other nations raced to understand stealth. Russia had to catch up. In the end, the story of those helicopters landing near the Arctic listening post isn't really about stealth technology. It's about the moment when technological dominance shifted. It's about the instant when Colonel Petrov realized that 30 years of confident superiority could be rendered obsolete by a fundamentally different way of thinking about a problem. And it's a story that still echoes today. Stealth remains the dominant principle in modern military aviation. Every fighter aircraft designed in the last 30 years carries stealth principles. Every bomber, every drone, every aircraft that needs to survive on a modern battlefield is shaped by the legacy of those invisible helicopters that Soviet radar couldn't see. The Iron Curtain was supposed to be impenetrable. It was designed to keep threats out and security in, but you can't keep out something you can't detect. You can't defend against something you can't see. And once that principle becomes clear, once you understand that invisibility is possible, that radar waves can be scattered and deflected and defeated, the game changes forever. Colonel Petrov died in 2004, never seeing the full extent of what he had witnessed in the beginning. But in those first moments of confusion, when the radar screens went blank and the helicopters vanished, he had glimpsed the future. A future where traditional defenses meant nothing, where technological supremacy couldn't be assumed, where the next revolution in warfare wouldn't come from flying higher or faster, but from the radical idea of simply not being there when the radar looked. In a bunker deep in the Arctic, operators still man radar stations. The equipment is more advanced now, more capable of detecting stealth aircraft than it was in 1986, but the fundamental principle remains unchanged. Somewhere, engineers are working to make things invisible, and somewhere else, engineers are working to see them anyway. The game continues, as it always does. But it was in October 1986, when helicopters landed near a Soviet listening post and left no trace, that everyone understood for certain. The old certainties were gone. The age of traditional military dominance had ended, and something entirely new had begun.